Introduction. This is a spoken summary of David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature, a work he published between the years 1739 and 1740, while he was still in his 20s. It is one of the most ambitious books in the history of philosophy, and this narration follows the author's own order of argument through its three books: the understanding, the passions, and morals. Throughout, the aim is to explain Hume's actual claims faithfully, in his own terms, keeping his central distinctions and a number of his most memorable phrases. Hume opens the treatise with an introduction that sets out both a complaint and a program. He notes how usual and how natural it is for those who claim to discover something new in philosophy to praise their own systems by decrying all those advanced before them. He grants that the complaint against earlier philosophy is largely just. The systems of the past, he says, rest on principles taken upon trust, on consequences lamely deduced from them, on a want of coherence in the parts and of evidence in the whole. Even, as he puts it, the rabble without doors can judge from the noise and clamor of philosophical dispute that all is not well within. And in these disputes, he observes, it is not reason that carries the prize, but eloquence. From this dismal record, there has arisen a common prejudice against all metaphysical reasoning, by which most people mean any argument that is at all abstruse and requires some attention to follow. Hume argues that this aversion is not justified. If truth is within reach of human capacity at all, he says, it is certain that it must lie very deep and abstruse, and he refuses to promise easy results. The heart of the introduction is a single strategic idea. All the sciences, Hume says, have a relation, greater or less, to human nature. Even mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural religion depend in some measure on the science of man, since they are all judged by human faculties and powers. The sciences most intimately connected with human nature are four: logic, morals, criticism, and politics. Logic explains the principles and operations of our reasoning faculty and the nature of our ideas. Morals and criticism concern our tastes and sentiments, and politics considers men as united in society and dependent on one another. Rather than continuing the tedious, lingering method of taking a castle or a village on the frontier of knowledge, Hume proposes to march up directly to the capital, or center of these sciences, to human nature itself. Once we are masters of that, he expects an easy victory everywhere else. He is proposing, in effect, a complete system of the sciences built on a foundation almost entirely new. That foundation is experience. The only solid ground for the science of man, he insists, must be laid on experience and observation. He warns that any hypothesis which pretends to discover the ultimate original qualities of human nature ought to be rejected at once as presumptuous and chimerical. We cannot, he says, go beyond experience. He also concedes a peculiar difficulty in the moral sciences. Unlike the natural philosopher, the student of the mind cannot make experiments deliberately and with premeditation, because the very act of reflecting on a passion, in the moment of feeling it, would disturb its natural operation. Instead, he says, we must glean our experiments in this science from a cautious observation of human life, taking them as they appear in the common course of the world, in men's behavior in company, in their affairs, and in their pleasures. A brief note that Hume attaches to the first book explains his plan of publication. His whole design, he says, is explained in the introduction, but not all the subjects he sketched there appear in these first volumes. The understanding and the passions, he judges, make a complete chain of reasoning by themselves, and he was willing to take advantage of this natural division in order to try the taste of the public. If he meets with success, he says, he will proceed to morals, politics, and criticism, which would complete the work. Book 1, Part 1, of Ideas, Their Origin, Composition, Connection, and Abstraction. Book 1 concerns the understanding, and it begins with the raw materials of thought. Hume's very first claim is a division. All the perceptions of the human mind, he writes, resolve themselves into two distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. The difference between them lies in their degrees of force and liveliness. Impressions are the ones that enter with most force and violence. Under this name he includes all our sensations, passions, and emotions as they first make their appearance in the soul. Ideas are the faint images of these impressions in thinking and reasoning. When I see a color or feel a pain, that is an impression. When I later remember or imagine it, that is an idea. Cutting across this first division is a second, between simple and complex perceptions. Simple perceptions admit of no distinction or separation. Complex ones can be divided into parts. The color, taste, and smell of an apple, he notes, are qualities united together in a single object, yet they are plainly distinguishable from one another. With these tools, Hume states the first principle of his whole philosophy of mind. There is, he observes, a great resemblance between our impressions and our ideas. The ideas seem, in a sense, to be reflections of the impressions, but the resemblance is exact only for simple perceptions. We can imagine a new Jerusalem paved with gold and walled with rubies, though we have never seen such a thing. We cannot form an idea, a perfect copy of a city like Paris that we have actually seen. The rule, then, applies to simple perceptions, and it runs that all our simple ideas, in their first appearance, are derived from simple impressions, which are correspondent to them, and which they exactly represent. His proof is the constant conjunction of the two, and above all, their order of appearance. The simple impressions always take precedence. To give a child the idea of scarlet, you present the impression, the color itself. And where a bodily organ is lacking, so that no impression can enter, the corresponding idea is missing too. A man born blind can form no idea of colors. A man who has never tasted a pineapple can never accurately imagine its flavor. Hume honestly records one apparent exception, the case now known as the missing shade of blue. Suppose a person acquainted with every shade of blue except one, arranged before him in a gradual scale with a single gap. Hume thinks the person could, from imagination alone, raise up the idea of the missing shade, even though it never entered by an impression. He admits the instance shows that simple ideas are not always derived from correspondent impressions, but he judges it so particular and singular that it is scarcely worth our notice, and he declines to alter his general maxim for its sake. Having established where impressions come first, Hume divides them into impressions of sensation and impressions of reflection. Those of sensation arise in the soul originally, from unknown causes. The study of their ultimate origin, he says, belongs to anatomists and natural philosophers rather than to him. Those of reflection are derived from our ideas. An impression such as heat or cold or thirst leaves behind a copy, an idea. When that idea of pleasure or pain returns to the mind, it produces new impressions, such as desire and aversion, hope and fear, and these are the impressions of reflection. Because the passions thus arise by way of ideas, Hume chooses, against the natural order, to treat ideas first. Ideas themselves reappear in two faculties. When an impression returns and keeps a considerable degree of its first vivacity, that is the memory. When it loses that vivacity and becomes a mere idea, that is the imagination. The memory is much more lively and strong, and it is, in a manner, tied down to the original order and position of its perceptions, whereas the imagination is free to transpose and change its ideas at pleasure. It is this liberty of the imagination that lets us frame, in poems and romances, winged horses, fiery dragons, and monstrous giants. The mind can separate the simple ideas that experience gave it and recombine them however it likes. Yet the imagination is not wholly ungoverned. If ideas were entirely loose, they would never join into the trains and orders we actually find in thought. There must be, Hume says, some universal principles, some bond of union, some associating quality by which one idea naturally introduces another. This is not an inseparable connection, but, in his careful phrase, a gentle force which commonly prevails. The associating qualities are three: resemblance, contiguity in time or place, and cause and effect. A picture leads our thought to the original by resemblance. Mention of one room leads to thoughts of the next by contiguity, and the thought of a wound carries us to the pain that follows it by cause and effect. Of the three, causation is the most extensive, for it links not only objects that produce one another, but also relations of interest and duty, such as those of master and servant, or judge and subject. Hume calls this associating tendency a kind of attraction, which he says will be found to have as extraordinary effects in the mental world as gravitation has in the natural. Its ultimate causes are mostly unknown and must be resolved into original qualities of human nature. The part closes with two more difficult topics. The first is the idea of substance. Hume asks from what impression the idea of a substance could be derived, and finds none. It is not a particular color, sound, or taste, and it is not any passion. We have, therefore, he concludes, no idea of substance, distinct from that of a collection of particular qualities. A substance, for the mind, is simply a bundle of simple ideas united by the imagination and given a single name. We suppose the qualities to inhere in an unknown something, and we allow new qualities to be added under the same name, as when we learn that gold, besides its color and weight, is also soluble in aqua regia. The second topic is abstract or general ideas. Here Hume defends a doctrine he credits to a great philosopher, Berkeley, and calls one of the greatest and most valuable discoveries of recent years: that all general ideas are nothing but particular ideas annexed to a general term. His thesis is that abstract ideas are in themselves individual, however general they may become in their representation. The mind, he argues, cannot form the idea of a quantity or quality without forming a precise notion of its degree. Everything in nature is individual, and there is no such thing as a triangle in general, with no particular length of sides or size of angles. What happens is this: a set of resembling objects receives a common name. Hearing the name revives the idea of one of them, together with a custom or habit that keeps the mind ready to survey any of the others as occasion requires. If we assert that the three angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles, while imagining a particular equilateral figure, the other kinds of triangle, the scalene and the isosceles, immediately crowd into the mind to check any false step. Hume ends with what he calls the distinction of reason, the way we distinguish, for example, the figure of a body from its color, though the two cannot really be separated. We manage it, he says, by comparison. Seeing a white globe and a black one, and a white cube, we notice two different resemblances, and so learn to attend to the figure apart from the color, though in the object they remain one. Book 1, Part 2, of the Ideas of Space and Time. The second part of Book 1 turns to two ideas that had long tormented philosophers: space, or extension, and time, or duration. Hume's central and deliberately provocative claim is that our ideas of space and time are composed of a finite number of simple, indivisible parts, and that the doctrine of infinite divisibility, so dear to the geometers, is not merely difficult, but strictly impossible. His argument begins from the mind itself. The capacity of the mind, he says, is limited, and can never attain a full and adequate conception of infinity. Therefore, the idea we form of any finite quantity is not infinitely divisible. By suitable divisions, the imagination reaches a minimum, an idea which cannot be diminished without a total annihilation. Take the 10,000th part of a grain of sand, he suggests. The mind has no distinct image of a part smaller than a certain point, and below that point lies not a smaller image, but nothing at all. The same holds for the impressions of sense. Put a spot of ink on paper and retire until it vanishes. The moment before it disappeared, the image was minute and yet perfectly indivisible. A microscope or a telescope does not really give us new and smaller parts of impressions. It produces new, larger impressions, out of what before seemed simple. From this psychology, Hume draws a metaphysical conclusion by a foundational maxim. Wherever ideas are adequate representations of objects, the relations and contradictions and agreements of the ideas are all applicable to the objects themselves. Since our ideas of the least parts of extension are adequate, whatever is contradictory in those ideas is really impossible in things. Now, whatever is infinitely divisible contains an infinite number of parts, and an infinite number of parts, each with some extension, however small, would compose an object infinitely large. Since no finite extension is infinitely large, no finite extension is infinitely divisible. The same reasoning applies to time, with a further consideration. The parts of time cannot coexist, for the year 1737, as he puts it, cannot concur with the present year 1738. Each moment must be distinct from, and successive to, the others. Time as it exists, then, must be composed of indivisible moments. Hume insists these are demonstrations, not mere difficulties, and adds a principle he will use again. Whatever the mind clearly conceives includes the idea of possible existence. We can conceive a golden mountain, and so it is possible. We cannot conceive a mountain without a valley, and so that is impossible. Where do these ideas come from? From the senses, and here again impressions take precedence. Looking at the table before him, Hume says, his senses convey only impressions of colored points disposed in a certain manner. The idea of extension is nothing but a copy of these colored points and of the manner of their arrangement. It is an abstract idea, formed by leaving out the particular color and attending only to the disposition. The idea of time, likewise, is derived not from any single impression, but from the succession of our perceptions of every kind, ideas and impressions alike. Time never appears by itself. A man sound asleep, or one strongly occupied with a single thought, is, for that interval, insensible of time. Where we have no succession of perceptions, Hume says, we have no notion of time. 5 notes played upon a flute give us the idea of time, and yet the time is not a sixth impression presented to the ear or any other sense. It is only the manner in which the 5 notes succeed one another. He then draws 2 striking corollaries. First, we can form no idea of a vacuum, that is, of extension, without any body to fill it. What we take for such an idea, when we imagine 2 objects separated by empty darkness, is really the idea of an invisible and intangible distance, which resembles true extension in certain respects, but conveys no real idea of it, since a stretch of pure darkness has no parts and no composition. Second, and by the same reasoning, we can form no idea of time without change, no empty duration in which nothing happens. In the course of this discussion, Hume states a general maxim of his Science of Human Nature that will recur throughout the treatise. Wherever there is a close relation between 2 ideas, the mind is very apt to mistake them, and in all its reasonings to use the one for the other. It is this proneness to confusion, he says, and not any genuine perception, that generates the illusions of empty space and empty time. Finally, Hume examines the idea of existence itself and finds it curiously empty. There is, he says, no impression or idea of any kind that we do not conceive as existent, but there is no separate impression of existence conjoined with each perception. He concludes, the idea of existence, then, is the very same with the idea of what we conceive to be existent. To reflect on a thing simply and to reflect on it as existing are not 2 different acts. As for existence outside the mind, he presses the point that nothing is ever really present to the mind but its own perceptions. To hate, to love, to think, to feel, to see, he writes, all this is nothing but to perceive. We can never so much as conceive anything specifically different from our ideas and impressions. This, he says, is the universe of the imagination, and the utmost we can do toward reaching external objects is to form a relative idea of them, without pretending to comprehend what they are in themselves. Book 1, Part 3, of Knowledge and Probability. The third part of Book 1 is the philosophical core of the whole treatise, and it contains the arguments for which Hume is most famous: his analysis of cause and effect, his problem of induction, his account of belief, and his radical claim about necessary connection. The governing question is what we can genuinely know, as opposed to what we merely believe with some degree of probability. Hume begins by listing 7 philosophical relations and sorting them into 2 classes. 4 of them, resemblance, contrariety, degrees in equality, and proportions in quantity or number, depend entirely on the ideas we compare. While the ideas remain the same, these relations cannot change, and so they are objects of knowledge and certainty. 3 of them, 3 we grasp at first sight by intuition, and only proportion in quantity or number admits of long demonstration through the chains of argument we find in algebra and arithmetic. The other 3 relations, identity, situation in time and place, and causation, can change without any change in the ideas, because they depend on matters of fact that lie beyond the ideas themselves. Of these, only one lets the mind reason beyond what is immediately present to the senses and the memory, and that one is causation. Identity and the relations of time and place we discover only by perception. It is cause and effect alone that assures us of an existence or an event we do not directly observe. So Hume sets out to trace the idea of causation to its origin. Examining any case of cause and effect, he finds 2 relations plainly present. The cause and the effect are contiguous, next to one another in space and time, or linked by a chain of contiguous things, and the cause is prior in time to the effect. But contiguity and succession, he argues, are not enough. When we call one thing the cause of another, we suppose something more, a necessary connection between them, and it is on this supposed necessary connection that the whole force of the relation depends. He cannot at first find any impression from which the idea of this connection might be copied, and so he sets the question aside and approaches it by 2 others. Why we hold that whatever begins to exist must have a cause, and why we conclude that particular causes must have particular effects. To the first he gives a startling answer. The maxim that whatever begins to exist must have a cause is neither intuitively nor demonstratively certain. Since all distinct ideas are separable, he says, we can conceive an object to be non-existent at this moment and existent the next, without joining to it any distinct idea of a cause or productive principle, and whatever we can conceive without contradiction is possible. He reviews the standard proofs of the maxim, such as the claim that a thing arising without a cause would produce itself, or would be produced by nothing, and dismisses them all as covertly assuming the very point in question. The belief that every beginning of existence has a cause, then, does not come from any insight of reason. It arises from observation and experience, and its explanation is folded into the second question. That second question is the great one, and Hume approaches it carefully. All reasoning about cause and effect, he first notes, must be anchored in something present, an impression of the senses or memory. The chain of inference cannot run back forever, but must terminate in some fact of which we are immediately aware. Our belief that Caesar was killed in the Senate House on the Ides of March rests, at the last, on present impressions, the characters and letters of historians, seen or remembered now. Without some such present impression to give it life, no reasoning about matters of fact would carry any belief or evidence. Now to the inference itself. When we infer the existence of one thing from another, flame from smoke or heat from flame, is the transition founded on reason or on something else? Hume argues that it cannot be founded on reason, for a chain of reasons is nowhere to be found. There is nothing in any object, considered in itself, that can give us a reason to draw a conclusion beyond it, and were we to consider the objects in the abstract, before any experience, anything might seem able to produce anything. It is by experience only, he says, that we come to infer one from another. Experience shows us that objects of one kind have always, in the past, been constantly conjoined with objects of another kind, flame always attended with heat, snow always with cold. This constant conjunction is a new relation added to contiguity and succession, but here Hume drives in the decisive wedge. From the mere repetition of past instances, however often repeated, even to infinity, there can never arise any new original idea, such as that of a necessary connection. Repetition tells us nothing that a single instance did not. The problem, then, is this. When we pass from the impression of the flame to the expectation of heat, our inference secretly assumes a principle, that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience, that the course of nature continues always uniformly the same. Can this principle of uniformity be proved? Not by demonstration, for we can distinctly conceive a change in the course of nature, an alteration in which snow should taste of salt or fire feel cold. And whatever we can clearly conceive is possible, so no contradiction lies in supposing the future to differ from the past. Nor can it be proved by probable or causal reasoning, for all such reasoning already presupposes the very uniformity in question, and to use it here would be to argue in a circle, making the principle both the cause and the effect of our conclusion. Therefore, Hume concludes, the transition from the observed to the unobserved is not determined by reason at all, but by the imagination, working through the associating principle of custom or habit. After we have seen flame joined with heat many times, the appearance of the one carries the mind, by a smooth and habitual transition, to the idea of the other. And this yields his famous inversion of the ordinary view. It is not that we infer the effect because we perceive a necessary connection, but rather that the necessary connection, so far as it means anything in the objects, depends upon the inference. The connection is in us, not in them. What, then, is belief? Hume denies that believing something adds any new idea to our conception of it. When we merely conceive of an object, and when we believe it exists, the idea conceived is exactly the same. Existence, he had already argued, adds nothing to the idea of a thing. The atheist and the theist, he notes, form the same idea when they think of God, though the one affirms and the other denies his existence. The difference between conceiving a thing and believing it, therefore, cannot lie in the parts or arrangement of the idea, but only in the manner in which the idea is conceived, in its force and vivacity. Belief, he offers, is a lively idea related to or associated with a present impression. It is not a separate act of pure intellect, but a peculiar feeling, a firmer and more vivid grasp of an idea. He appeals to experience. To read a book as true history, and to read the very same book as a romance, is to have the same ideas before the mind, and yet the historian's reader, enters into the events with a more lively conception, and that difference of feeling just is belief. Where does this superior vivacity come from? From a present impression, transmitted along one of the relations of association. A present impression communicates a share of its force and liveliness to any idea related to it. The portrait of an absent friend enlivens our idea of him by resemblance. Standing near our home makes the thought of our family more vivid by contiguity, and the relics of a saint, the very handiwork of the holy man, enliven the devotion of the pilgrim by causation. But Hume shows that a present impression only produces belief in its usual attendant after we have experienced the two in constant conjunction. And this experienced conjunction, operating without any new act of reasoning, is precisely what he means by custom. All probable reasoning, he writes, is nothing but a species of sensation. The man who stops at a swollen river does not pause to recollect past drownings and construct an argument. The custom operates before he has time for reflection. Belief matters, Hume adds, because it is what lets our ideas move us. Nature has given belief the office of raising a mere idea up to something like the influence of an impression, so that it can act upon the passions and the will. This is why belief and passion so often reinforce one another. The coward readily believes every report of danger, the melancholy man believes whatever feeds his gloom, and the astonished patient readily believes the promises of a quack. Belief also lends an air of truth to the fictions of poets, which borrow strength from familiar names drawn from history. In the remaining sections, Hume refines his account. He distinguishes knowledge, proofs, which are causal arguments so free from doubt that we do not even call them merely probable, such as that the sun will rise or that all men are mortal, and probability properly so called, which is still attended with uncertainty. He treats the probability of chances, arguing that chance is nothing real in itself, but merely the absence of a known cause, so that our expectation simply follows the greater number of equal chances. He treats the probability of causes, where our experience has been mixed. Here, belief is a hesitating thing, and we make the past the standard for the future by habit, our expectation dividing among the various outcomes in proportion to how often each has occurred, as when we look for 19 of 20 ships to return safely. Each new experiment, he says, is as a new stroke of the pencil, adding a further vividness to the colors of our expectation. He states his two guiding principles plainly, that there is nothing in any object, considered in itself, which can give us a reason for a conclusion beyond it, and that even after observing the frequent or constant conjunction of objects, we have no reason to draw any inference concerning any object beyond those we have experienced. He also considers what he calls unphilosophical probability, the ways our beliefs are swayed by factors reason would not sanction. The fading of evidence as a remembered fact grows remote, the greater force of a fresh experiment over a stale one, and above all the influence of hasty general rules, which produce prejudice, as when a man refuses to allow that an Irishman can have wit or a Frenchman's solidity. Here he introduces a valuable contrast. The imagination forms rash general rules, and reflection forms wiser ones that correct them, so that the difference between the vulgar and the wise is that the wise correct one general rule by another. Then Hume returns to the deferred question, the idea of necessary connection, and gives his central analysis. Every idea, he repeats, is copied from an impression, so the idea of necessity must come from some impression too. But when we examine any single instance of cause and effect, we find only contiguity and succession. We never perceive any power or force by which the cause produces the effect. Observing many instances adds nothing to any one of them, for, as he says, the reflection on several instances only repeats the same objects, and therefore can never give rise to a new idea. And yet, after many instances, something new does appear, not in the objects, but in the mind. Upon seeing the one object, the mind is now determined by custom to pass to the idea of its usual attendant, and it is this internal feeling of determination, this felt transition of thought, that is the impression from which the idea of necessity is copied. He surveys and rejects the alternatives, the occult powers of the schoolmen, and the appeal of certain philosophers to the will of God as the true cause of every event, on the ground that we find no more impression of real power in the deity than in bodies, and can therefore form no genuine idea of it there either. His conclusion is the most violent paradox of the book. Necessity is something that exists in the mind, not in objects. Either we have no idea of necessity at all, he writes, or necessity is nothing but that determination of the thought to pass from causes to effects, and from effects to causes. We are deceived about this, he says, by the mind's propensity to spread itself upon external objects, projecting its own felt transitions outward as if they were features of the world. This yields his two celebrated definitions of a cause. Considered as a philosophical relation, a cause is an object precedent and contiguous to another, where all objects resembling the first are placed in like relations of precedency and contiguity to objects resembling the second. Considered as a natural relation, that is, as it actually works in the mind, a cause is an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it that the idea of the one determines the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. Constant conjunction on the side of the objects, and the determination of thought on the side of the mind, are the whole of what we mean by cause and effect, because nothing in an object, taken by itself, marks it as a cause or an effect. Hume observes that, so far as bare a priori reflection can tell, anything might produce anything. Only experience teaches us which conjunctions actually hold. So he offers a short set of rules by which to judge of causes and effects, 8 rules he calls all the logic he thinks proper to employ, among them that cause and effect must be contiguous, that the cause must be prior, that there must be a constant union between them, that the same cause always produces the same effect, and that where several objects produce the same effect, it must be by some quality they have in common. The rules, he remarks dryly, are easy to state but extremely difficult to apply, especially in moral subjects, where the circumstances are so complicated. Hume ends the part with a test he treats as decisive, the reason of animals. Nothing, he says, appears to him more evident than that beasts are endowed with thought and reason as well as men, for we infer their inner operations from the resemblance of their actions to ours, just as we infer one another's. Any account of the human understanding that requires subtleties beyond the reach of animals, children, and ordinary people must therefore be false. Now a dog that has learned to expect a beating from a certain tone of voice reasons exactly as we do, from a present impression, along a habit built by past conjunction, to the expectation of what usually follows. The beast plainly never perceives any real connection among events, and never frames the general thought that the unobserved must resemble the observed. It is by custom alone that experience operates upon it. And this, Hume says, is an invincible proof of his whole system, for what governs the beast governs us. His final phrase turns the tables on the pride of reason. Reason itself, he says, is nothing but a wonderful and unintelligible instinct in our souls, and habit is only one of the principles of nature, deriving all its force from that origin. Book 1, Part 4, of the Skeptical and Other Systems of Philosophy. The fourth part of Book 1 pushes Hume's principles to their skeptical limit, and then examines how the mind lives in spite of that skepticism. It moves through skepticism with regard to reason, skepticism with regard to the senses, a critique of ancient and of modern philosophy, a discussion of the soul, the famous account of personal identity, and a deeply personal conclusion. Hume begins by arguing that all knowledge degenerates into probability. Even in a demonstrative science, the rules may be certain, but the faculty that applies them is fallible. Every reasoning, therefore, ought to be checked by a further judgment about the reliability of our own judging. No mathematician trusts a fresh proof at once. His confidence grows only as he reviews it, as friends confirm it, and as it wins the assent of the learned world, which is a mere accumulation of probabilities. But now the check can be checked again, and that check again, without end. To the first probability we add a doubt about our faculties, and to that a doubt about the estimate of our faculties, and so on to infinity, each step diminishing the assurance of the last. No finite belief, Hume argues, can survive an unending series of such reductions. By the strict rules of logic, belief and evidence ought to be extinguished entirely. Yet, no one has ever really been so thoroughgoing a skeptic, Hume among them. The reason is that belief is not, at bottom, an act of the reasoning faculty at all. Nature, by an absolute and uncontrollable necessity, he writes, has determined us to judge as well as to breathe and feel. Belief is more properly an act of the sensitive than of the cogitative part of our natures. It is a lively manner of conceiving, which the thin and strained abstractions of the skeptic cannot really touch. When the skeptical argument is pushed too far, the mind's grip on it grows faint, the reasoning becomes forced and unnatural, its ideas lose their vivacity, and the destructive conclusion simply fails to move us. Nature, in short, breaks the force of all skeptical arguments in time. Hume then asks what causes us to believe in the existence of body in an external world. He is careful about the question. We may well ask, he says, what causes induce us to believe in the existence of body? But it is vain to ask whether there is body or not, for that we must take for granted in all our reasonings. He divides the belief into two: our belief that objects have a continued existence when we do not perceive them, and our belief that they have a distinct existence, independent of and external to the mind. He then tests three possible sources. It is not the senses, for they present only a single perception, and cannot tell us of anything continuing beyond perception or existing apart from it. It is not reason, for children and peasants, and indeed almost all mankind, believe firmly in body without any philosophical argument, and the vulgar belief actually confuses the perception with the object. It must therefore be the imagination. The imagination builds the belief upon two features of our impressions. The first is constancy. The mountains and houses and trees present themselves to me when I return to them, in the same order and with the same qualities as before. The second, where constancy fails, is coherence. Even when objects change in my absence, they change in regular, dependent ways, so that my fire has burned down while I was out exactly as it would have done had I watched it. Hume gives a vivid example. I hear a creak that I have learned to associate with the opening of a door. A moment later, a porter appears with a letter from a friend 200 leagues away. To make sense of this, I silently suppose the continued existence of the door, the stairs, the porter, the roads, the sea and continent between us, filling in a whole world I do not perceive. The imagination, once set in motion, continues its course like a galley, still gliding after the oars have stopped, and completes the uniformity it has begun. Because resembling but interrupted perceptions are so alike, the mind slides over the gaps and takes them for one continued thing, and, feeling the contradiction between this supposed identity and the observed interruptions, it invents the fiction of a continued existence to smooth the difficulty away, and lends that fiction the vivacity of the remembered perceptions, which is belief. Yet philosophy, examining the matter, cannot rest in the vulgar view. Simple experiments show that our perceptions are dependent and fleeting. Press one eye and objects appear double. The same table seems to shrink as we withdraw from it. A fever alters every color. So the philosophers invent a double existence, of perishing perceptions on one side and continued objects on the other. But this system, Hume argues, has no original recommendation either to reason or to the imagination. It borrows all its plausibility from the vulgar belief it is meant to replace, and he calls it the monstrous offspring of two principles that contradict each other: the imagination that insists on continued existence, and the reflection that insists our perceptions are interrupted. Having begun, he confesses, intending to trust his senses, he ends more inclined to place no faith at all in them, or rather, in the imagination. It is a gross illusion, he says, to suppose that our resembling perceptions are numerically the same, and this doubt is a malady that can never be radically cured. The only cure is carelessness and inattention. An hour hence, he wryly notes, he will believe again in both an external and an internal world. Turning to the philosophers, Hume treats the ancient and modern systems as further illustrations of the imagination's fictions. The scholastic apparatus of substance, substantial forms, and occult qualities he treats as monuments to our tendency to feign an unknown something, to reconcile the changes and the composition we observe in objects with the unity and sameness we insist on ascribing to them. He notes a memorable ranking of three grades of opinion: the vulgar, the false philosophy, and the true, and observes that the true philosophy actually comes nearer to the sentiments of the vulgar than the false does. As for the modern philosophy, its fundamental principle is that colors, sounds, tastes, smells, heat, and cold are nothing but impressions in the mind, without any resemblance to qualities in the objects, so that only the primary qualities, extension and solidity, figure and motion, are truly in things. Hume accepts the one good argument for this, drawn from the variation of our sensations while the object is unchanged, but then turns it against the moderns. Strip the secondary qualities away, he argues, and you cannot even keep the primary ones, for the idea of extension depends on that of something colored or solid, and the idea of solidity in turn cannot be grasped except through bodies that are already solid, so that the account runs in a circle and leaves us no clear idea of matter at all. The upshot is a direct and total opposition, he says, between our reason and our senses. Reason, following out cause and effect, ends by denying to the external world the very qualities the senses insist upon. Hume then examines the doctrine of the immateriality and simplicity of the soul, and treats the whole question as, in the end, unintelligible. Since we have no impression of any substance, mental or material, we have no genuine idea of one, and the disputes about whether thought inheres in a material or an immaterial substance rest on words we cannot cash out. He even argues, provocatively, that the theologian's picture of many perceptions inhering in one simple soul is open to the very same objections they raise against the single substance of Spinoza. And on the question whether motion in the brain could ever cause thought, he applies his own doctrine of causation, since we never perceive any necessary connection in any cause whatever, and since experience plainly shows that changes in the body do change our thoughts, we have as much reason to allow that matter and motion may cause thought as to allow any other causal connection. The question of the soul's substance, he concludes, is absolutely unintelligible, though he adds a careful remark that his philosophy takes nothing away from religion, since the arguments about the soul's duration are equally inconclusive on every side. The most influential section of this part is the one on personal identity. Philosophers, Hume observes, suppose we are every moment intimately conscious of a self, a simple and continued thing. But from what impression could the idea of such a self be derived? It would have to be some one impression that continued unchanged through the whole of life, and there is no such constant and invariable impression for pain and pleasure, grief and joy, pass and repass in perpetual succession. Consequently, there is no such idea. He offers the report of his own introspection, one of the most quoted passages in philosophy. When he enters most intimately into what he calls himself, he says, he always stumbles on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred. He never catches himself at any time without a perception, and never observes anything but the perception. In sound and dreamless sleep, insensible of himself, he may truly be said not to exist at all. Mankind, he therefore concludes, are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed one another with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. The mind, he says in a famous image, is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures. But the comparison must not mislead us, for there is no stage on which they are performed, and no place where these scenes are represented. There is, properly speaking, no simplicity in the mind at one time, and no identity through different times. Why, then, do we so confidently ascribe a continued identity to ourselves? By the same mechanism that gives us the identity of plants, ships, and animals. A river remains, we say, the same river for ages, though its waters change ceaselessly. An oak grows from a sapling to a great tree, and a man from an infant to an adult, though not one particle of matter, and scarcely any quality, remains the same. In each case, the mind, running smoothly along a chain of closely related and gradually changing objects, mistakes the succession for an unchanging identity, and feigns a soul, a self, a substance, to disguise the variation. Personal identity, Hume concludes, is of exactly this kind, a fiction the imagination produces out of the relations of resemblance and causation among our perceptions. Memory is essential to it, not because memory creates the identity, but because it acquaints us with the chain of past perceptions and, by raising their images, produces the resemblance that binds the whole together. He compares the mind to a republic or commonwealth, whose members and even whose laws may change while it remains, by a continued succession, the same body. And he suggests that most of the disputes about personal identity are merely verbal, turning on the loose and variable way we apply the word identity, rather than on any real question. Book 1 closes with an extraordinary conclusion in which Hume dramatizes the skeptical crisis his own reasonings have produced. He compares himself to a man who, having narrowly escaped shipwreck on many shoals, has still the temerity to put out to sea in the same leaky, weather-beaten vessel. Surveying the wretched condition and disorder of the faculties he has been employing, he is reduced almost to despair and struck with melancholy. He feels himself, he says, a strange, uncouth monster, expelled from all human commerce, having drawn upon himself the enmity of metaphysicians, logicians, mathematicians, and theologians alike. His difficulties multiply. The memory, senses, and understanding he now sees are all founded on the imagination and the vivacity of ideas. Two of his most natural and necessary operations, the inference from cause to effect and the belief in a continued external world, turn out to be flatly contrary to one another. And when he traces the understanding to its first principles, all his labor seems to dissolve into the discovery that the sought-for tie or connection lies merely in ourselves. Reason, pursued to the end, threatens to subvert itself entirely, leaving us, he says, with no choice but between a false reason and none at all. The intense view of these contradictions has, he confesses, so wrought upon him that he is ready to reject all belief in reasoning, and can look upon no opinion even as more probable than another. Where am I, he asks, or what? From what causes do I derive my existence, and to what condition shall I return? Then comes the cure, and it is not an argument. Most fortunately, he writes, since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices for that purpose, and cures him of his philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind, or by some amusement that obliterates the reasoning. I dine, he says. I play a game of backgammon. I converse, and am merry with my friends. And when after 3 or 4 hours' amusement I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any farther. Nature herself determines him to live and talk and act like other people. Philosophy, when it grows too fine, simply loses its hold. And yet curiosity revives, and ambition to understand the principles of moral good and evil, the nature of government, and the springs that move us. And this, he says, is the true origin of his philosophy. He ends by pleading for a mitigated skepticism. Since we cannot help reasoning, we should reason with modesty and diffidence. The true skeptic will be diffident of his doubts as well as of his convictions. He prefers philosophy to superstition, remarking that the errors in religion are dangerous, while those in philosophy are only ridiculous. And he cautions the reader that when, in what follows, he uses confident expressions such as it is evident, or it is certain, these are extorted from him by the present view of the object, and imply no dogmatical spirit. Book 2, Part 1, of Pride and Humility. Book 2 turns from the understanding to the passions, and its method is as systematic as anything in the first book. Hume begins by locating the passions within his general map of the mind. Impressions divide into the original impressions of sensation, which arise in the body from unknown causes, and the secondary or reflective impressions, which are the passions and emotions that arise from those original impressions or their ideas. Setting aside the bodily impressions as matters for the anatomist, he takes up the reflective ones, dividing them further into the calm passions, such as the sense of beauty and deformity, and the violent passions, such as love and hatred, or pride and humility, while cautioning that the division is far from exact. His most important distinction here is between direct and indirect passions. By direct passions, he means those that arise immediately from good or evil, from pain or pleasure, such as desire, aversion, joy, and grief. By indirect passions, he means those that proceed from the same sources, but only by the conjunction of other qualities, and among these are pride and humility, love and hatred, envy, pity, and malice. Part 1 is devoted to the first pair. Pride and humility, Hume says, are simple impressions that cannot really be defined, only described from experience. Though they are directly contrary to one another, they share a single object, and that object is the self, that connected succession of ideas and impressions of which we have an intimate memory and consciousness. But the object cannot also be the cause. If the self were what excited these passions, then since the self is equally the object of both, it would excite pride and humility together, and they would destroy one another, and a man cannot be at once proud and humble on the same account. So Hume distinguishes sharply between the object of a passion, which is always the self, and its cause, which is some further idea that first excites it. A passion, he says, is thus placed between two ideas, one that produces it, and one the self, that it in turn regards. The causes are enormously various. Qualities of our minds like wit and integrity, qualities of our bodies like beauty and strength, and things merely related to us like our houses, gardens, families, and possessions. Within each cause, he further distinguishes the quality that produces the pleasure, such as beauty, from the subject in which that quality resides, such as the house that is ours. The object, the self, is fixed by an original quality of our nature. The causes are natural, too, since the same things produce pride in every age and nation, but they are not original, for their number is so prodigious, and so many of them are the products of human art and accident, that it would be absurd to suppose nature had provided a separate principle for each. Hume invokes the example of astronomy. As Copernicus reduced the wandering motions of the heavens to a few principles, so moral philosophy should look for the one or few circumstances common to all the causes of pride, on which their efficacy depends. That common mechanism is the great discovery of Book 2, and Hume calls it the double relation of impressions and ideas. He builds it from two properties of the mind. The first is the association of ideas, by which the mind passes readily from one idea to another that resembles it, is contiguous to it, or is causally connected with it. The second is what he calls the association of impressions, by which resembling passions run into one another, grief passing into disappointment, disappointment into anger, and so around the circle. Impressions, he notes, are associated only by resemblance. When these two associations point the same way, they give the mind a double impulse. Now apply this to pride. Every cause of pride has two features. Its quality produces, on its own, a separate pleasure, and its subject is related to the self. And the passion itself has two settled features. Its object is the self, and its own sensation is agreeable. Set these side by side, and the fit is exact. The cause is related to the self, which is the object of the passion, and the separate pleasure the cause produces is related, by resemblance, to the agreeable sensation of pride. From this double relation, of ideas to the object and of impressions to the sensation, the passion arises. As Hume sums it up, anything that gives a pleasant sensation and is related to the self excites pride, which is itself agreeable and has the self for its object. Humility is produced by exactly the same machinery, except that the cause produces a separate pain instead of a pleasure. A beautiful house we own gives us pride, and the same house fallen into ugliness gives us humility. Hume adds several limitations that fine-tune the system. The relation of the pleasing object to ourselves must be close, closer than mere joy requires. The advantage must be more or less peculiar to us, for what is common to all mankind excites little pride, since we judge things more by comparison than by their intrinsic worth. The object should be evident to others as well as to ourselves. It should have some constancy and duration, for what is casual and fleeting gives little pride. And general rules exert great influence, so that we take pride according to the settled ranks and reputations that opinion attaches to wealth and power. He then runs the system through a series of particular causes, virtue and vice, which produce pride and humility whether morality rests on nature or on interest, since either way vice and virtue are felt as pain and pleasure, beauty and deformity of body, beauty being nothing but a form that produces pleasure, much of it derived from the idea of usefulness and convenience, property and riches, property being the relation that most reliably produces pride, and riches pleasing us as the very power of procuring the pleasures of life. And in explaining the love of fame, he introduces the concept that will dominate the rest of Book 2, sympathy, our propensity to receive by communication the inclinations and sentiments of others, however different from or contrary to our own. When we form the idea of another person's feeling, that idea is so enlivened by our constant intimate sense of ourselves, and by the resemblance of all human creatures to us, that it is converted into the very impression it represents, and we come to feel what they feel. Our love of fame, then, is a kind of secondary pride, reflected back to us from the good opinion of others, and we value most the praise of those we ourselves esteem. Book 2, Part 2, of Love and Hatred. The second part carries the same apparatus over to love and hatred, and here the parallel is exact and deliberate. As the object of pride and humility is the self, so the object of love and hatred, Hume says, is always some other person, of whose thoughts and feelings we are not immediately conscious. Again, the object cannot be the cause, since love and hatred are contrary and would otherwise cancel. Again, the cause divides into a quality that produces a separate pleasure or pain and a subject related to the person. And again, the passion arises from a double relation of ideas to the person who is its object, and of impressions to the agreeable or uneasy sensation that is its character. Hume sets the four passions in what he calls a square. Pride and humility are joined to love and hatred by their sensations, pride and love being agreeable, humility and hatred uneasy, and they are distinguished by their objects, pride and humility regarding the self, love and hatred regarding another. Nothing, he says, can produce any of these four passions without bearing this double relation of ideas to the object and of sensation to the passion. To establish this, Hume conducts what he calls a set of experiments, imagining himself and a companion, and running various qualities through the system. A quite indifferent object, a plain stone, bearing neither relation, produces no passion at all. An object related to us merely by ideas, but carrying no pleasure or pain, likewise produces nothing, for the relation of ideas pulls equally toward both contrary passions, and they cancel. An agreeable object with no relation to any person, such as a beautiful prospect glimpsed while traveling through a foreign land, produces only a fleeting overflow of good spirits, not a settled passion. But an object bearing both relations necessarily excites the appropriate passion, and if we shift the quality from ourselves to our companion, the affection wheels about from pride to love, and if we change the quality from good to bad, from love to hatred. Hume notes that the passions run easily from love and hatred up to pride and humility, so that a shining quality in a near relation gives us vanity. But the reverse transition from ourselves outward is far harder, because the mind passes readily from an obscure idea to a lively one, but only with difficulty from a lively idea back to an obscure. He also finds that the passions extend along relations, so that we come to love the whole family of one we love, and that they descend more easily than they ascend, a father's virtue winning the son more love than the son's virtue wins the father. Several difficulties then occupy him. He observes that our kindness or ill will toward a person tracks the pleasure or pain we receive from him, and that a lasting quality produces love or hatred without any design, whereas a momentary action must be seen as intentional to fasten a durable passion upon its author. The design, he says, strengthens the relation of impressions, since the sting of an injury lies chiefly in the contempt it shows. Strikingly, he argues that the idea of an injury does not produce our hatred, but arises from it. We first feel the passion and then seek reasons to justify it. He notes that mere relation to ourselves, of blood, country, neighborhood, trade, or even a shared name, can excite love, and so can simple acquaintance, both working by the same principle, that a relation conveys to the idea of another person some of the vivacity of our idea of ourselves, and a lively idea readily converts into an impression. A perfect solitude, he remarks, is perhaps the greatest punishment we can suffer, for we can form no wish that has not some reference to society. The section on our esteem for the rich and powerful is where sympathy does its most important work. Hume rules out the theory that we esteem the wealthy merely from hope of advantage, since we admire the rich even when we can expect nothing from them, prisoners, strangers, even the dead. What remains, he concludes, is sympathy alone. We enter into the satisfaction that the rich take in their own condition and partake of their pleasure. The famous image is that the minds of men are mirrors to one another, so that the rich man's pleasure in his possessions is reflected in the beholder's esteem, and that esteem is reflected back to give the possessor a further, secondary satisfaction. Much of the beauty we find in useful and convenient things, houses, fields, well-proportioned figures, works only through this sympathy with an owner or user. Hume then observes that love and hatred are always attended by, or rather conjoined with, benevolence and anger, love giving rise to a desire for the happiness of the person loved, and an aversion to his misery, hatred to the contrary desires, and he insists that these desires are not the same thing as love and hatred, but are joined to them by the original constitution of the mind. He treats pity and malice as instances of sympathy and its opposite. Pity is a concern for the misery of others, arising when their suffering strikes us so vividly, through the resemblance of all human creatures, that a lively idea is converted into the passion itself, and he notes the curious fact that we sometimes pity a person more, not less, when he bears his misfortune with unnatural composure, because the imagination supplies the grief we feel he ought to have. Malice and envy he grounds in the principle of comparison. Since we judge things by comparison rather than by their intrinsic value, the misery of another can give us a livelier idea of our own happiness, a kind of pity reversed, and envy is stirred not by great disproportions but by nearness, so that a common soldier envies his sergeant more than his general. He resolves an apparent puzzle that pity, an uneasy feeling, is mixed with love, while malice, a kind of joy, is mixed with hatred, by a refined principle. What fixes the character of a passion is not its momentary sensation, but the whole bent or tendency of it from beginning to end. Pity shares its direction with benevolence, the desire of another's good, and so allies itself with love. Malice shares its direction with anger, and so allies itself with hatred. And he adds the important qualification that a weak sympathy with another's distress may produce contempt, while a strong one produces tenderness, so that a moderate poverty is looked on with some scorn, but extreme misery excites compassion. He then explains respect and contempt as mixtures, respect being love blended with a humbling comparison, contempt being hatred blended with pride, and he closes the part with an account of the amorous passion, which he analyzes as a compound of three distinct feelings: the pleasure arising from beauty, the bodily appetite, and a generous kindness or goodwill, beauty standing in the middle and able to draw the other two along with it. Even the love and hatred of animals, he notes, obey the same simple principles, and sympathy plainly operates among the beasts, as when the animation of a pack of hounds inflames each dog beyond what he would feel alone. Book 2, Part 3, of the Will and Direct Passions. The third part of Book 2 contains some of Hume's most influential doctrines about action, freedom, and the relation of reason to desire. He begins with the will, which is not strictly a passion, but must be understood before the passions can be. By the will, he says, he means nothing but the internal impression we feel and are conscious of when we knowingly give rise to a new motion of the body or a new perception of the mind. Like the passions, it is a simple impression that cannot be further defined. His first great topic is liberty and necessity, and his position is what later philosophers call compatibilism. He proceeds by first asking what necessity in the material world really amounts to, and answering, from Book 1, that it is nothing but the constant conjunction of like objects together with the mind's determination to pass from one to the other. Necessity, he insists, does not lie in some perceived power in the agent. It lies in the observer who, seeing the regular union, infers the one from the other. There are, then, two things essential to necessity: the constant union and the inference of the mind. Wherever we find these, we must acknowledge necessity, and both, he argues, are present in human action as fully as in the motions of bodies. There is a striking uniformity in human conduct across ages, sexes, governments, and conditions. Like motives, in like circumstances, produce like actions, and we should give no more credit to a traveler who reported a people utterly unlike those of Plato's Republic or Hobbes's Leviathan than to one who told of centaurs. This uniformity, he says, forms the very essence of necessity, and we constantly rely on it. We infer men's actions from their characters and situations with the same confidence as we infer natural effects from natural causes. A prisoner, he observes, foresees his death as surely from the constancy and fidelity of his guards as from the operation of the axe. The two kinds of evidence, the natural and the moral, form a single chain in his mind. Since necessity is thus an essential part of causation, and since liberty, understood as the denial of necessity, would be the same as chance, Hume concludes that whoever reasons at all about human conduct already believes, in practice, that the actions of the will arise from necessity. The doctrine of liberty persists, he thinks, from a few confusions: a failure to distinguish the liberty of spontaneity, which merely means acting without external constraint and which he happily grants, from the liberty of indifference, which means acting without any cause at all, and which he rejects; a false inner sensation of freedom, since when we try to prove our liberty we feel the will move easily in any direction, though a bystander could often predict which way it will go; and a mistaken fear that necessity threatens religion and morality. On the contrary, Hume argues, necessity is essential to morality. Rewards and punishments, praise and blame, all assume that motives regularly produce actions. and responsibility itself requires necessity, for actions are by their nature temporary and perishing, and unless they flow from some durable cause in the character and disposition of the person, they cannot be imputed to him. Were actions the products of pure chance, a man would be as innocent after the most horrid crime as at the moment of his birth. We blame the deliberate more than the hasty deed, and we allow that repentance and reformation can wipe away a crime, precisely because we regard actions as evidence of lasting principles in the mind. His second great topic is the relation of reason to the passions, and here he overturns a long tradition. He argues, first, that reason alone can never be a motive to any action of the will, and second, that reason can never oppose passion in the direction of the will. Reason works in two ways: by demonstration concerning the relations of ideas, and by probable reasoning concerning causes and effects, and neither by itself moves us. Mathematics guides the merchant only because he already cares about his accounts. The prospect of pain or pleasure gives rise to the impulse, and reasoning about causes and effects merely directs that impulse toward its object. The impulse, Hume says, does not arise from reason, but is only directed by it. And since reason alone cannot produce a volition, it cannot alone prevent one either, for only a contrary impulse could do that. From this comes his most quoted sentence. We speak not strictly or philosophically, he says, when we talk of the combat of passion and of reason, for reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any office other than to serve and obey them. A passion, he explains, is an original existence, complete in itself, containing no representation of anything else. It is therefore neither true nor false, and cannot, properly speaking, be contrary to reason. When I am angry, he says, I am actually possessed with the passion, and no more refer to any other object than when I am thirsty or sick or more than 5 feet high. A passion can be called unreasonable only in a loose sense, when it rests on a false belief about what exists or chooses means insufficient to its end, and even then it is the accompanying judgment, not the passion, that is at fault. Hence his deliberately shocking illustrations. It is not contrary to reason, he says, to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger, nor to prefer my own total ruin to prevent the least uneasiness of a stranger. Reason may pronounce such preferences unwise, but not strictly irrational. Why, then, is reason so often thought to master passion? Because reason works quietly, producing no sensible emotion, and any calm operation of the mind is easily mistaken for reason itself. Hume distinguishes calm passions from violent ones. The calm passions include certain instincts implanted in our nature, such as benevolence, resentment, and the love of life, and the general appetite to good and aversion to evil as such. Because they stir a little visible emotion, we confuse them with cool judgments of reason. The violent passions, by contrast, produce a strong feeling. The old error, he says, was to ascribe the direction of the will to one principle alone. In truth, both operate, and men constantly act against their known interest under the sway of a violent passion, and also curb a violent passion in favor of a calm and distant interest. What we call strength of mind, he says, is nothing but the prevalence of the calm passions over the violent, though no one is so perfectly constant as never to be carried away. He notes importantly that calm is not the same as weak, nor violent as strong, and that the mere situation of an object, its nearness or distance in space and time, can turn a calm passion into a violent one and back again. The struggle he describes is therefore not between reason and passion, but between calmer and more turbulent affections, both of them passions. Book 3, Part 1, of Virtue and Vice in General. Book 3 treats morals, and Hume opens it by noting that this volume is in some measure independent of the first two, and may be followed with less of their abstract reasoning, though he keeps the same vocabulary of impressions and ideas. The first part asks the most basic question in ethics: how do we distinguish virtue from vice? And Hume's answer falls into two halves, a negative and a positive. The negative thesis is that moral distinctions are not derived from reason. His central argument turns on motivation. Morality, he observes, has a practical influence. It excites passions and produces or prevents actions. But reason, as Book 2 established, is entirely inert. It can never by itself produce or prevent any action. Therefore, he concludes, the rules of morality cannot be conclusions of our reason, for an active principle can never be founded on an inactive one. Actions, volitions, and passions are, as he puts it, original facts complete in themselves. They contain no representation, and so cannot be true or false, cannot be conformable or contrary to reason. Actions, he says, may be laudable or blamable, but they cannot in themselves be reasonable or unreasonable. Reason is wholly inactive, and can never be the source of anything so active as conscience or a sense of morals. He then attacks the view that virtue consists in conformity to some eternal relations, discoverable by the understanding. If it did, virtue would have to lie either in one of the demonstrable relations, or in some matter of fact. But the demonstrable relations, resemblance, contrariety, degrees in quality, and proportions in quantity, all hold equally among inanimate things, so that if morality lay in them, inanimate objects would be capable of virtue and vice. Hume presses this with his famous example of the young tree that grows up, overtops, and destroys the parent that seeded it. The very same relations are present here, the one thing, the cause of the other's existence, and then of its destruction, as in the case of a child who murders a parent, and yet there is no crime in the tree. What makes the human act criminal cannot, therefore, be the mere relations. Nor is morality a matter of fact that the understanding discovers in the object. Take any action allowed to be vicious, he says, willful murder, for instance, and examine it in every light. You will never find the vice, so long as you consider the object. The vice entirely escapes you until you turn your reflection into your own breast, and find there a sentiment of disapprobation that arises in you toward the action. Here is a matter of fact, he says, but it is the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not in the object. Vice and virtue, he concludes, may be compared to sounds, colors, heat, and cold, which are not, on the modern philosophy, qualities and objects, but perceptions in the mind. This part ends with the most celebrated single paragraph in the treatise, the passage on is and ought. In every system of morality he has met with, Hume says, the author proceeds for a while in the ordinary way, establishing the being of a god or making observations about human affairs, when all at once, instead of the usual connectives is and is not, he finds every proposition joined by an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but it is of the last consequence, for this ought or ought not expresses some new relation, and it seems altogether inconceivable how this new relation can be deduced from others entirely different from it. He recommends that readers demand a reason for this step whenever they meet it, and he suggests that attending to this small point would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality. The positive thesis follows at once. Since moral distinctions are not the work of reason, they must arise from some impression or sentiment. Morality, Hume says, is more properly felt than judged of, though the feeling is often so soft and gentle that we mistake it for an idea. The impressions in question are a particular kind of pleasure and pain. The sentiment arising from virtue is agreeable, and that from vice uneasy. To have the sense of virtue, he says, is nothing but to feel a satisfaction of a particular kind from the contemplation of a character. The very feeling constitutes our praise, and we go no further. We do not infer that a character is virtuous because it pleases us. Rather, in feeling that it pleases in this particular manner, we already feel that it is virtuous. He is careful to specify that this is a special kind of pleasure, and that not every agreeable thing is therefore virtuous. Good wine and good music both please, he notes, yet we do not call the wine harmonious or the music flavorful. Likewise, the moral sentiment is a distinct species of pleasure, felt only when we consider a character in general, from a point of view detached from our own particular interest. And he insists that so many and various duties cannot each spring from a separate original instinct, since nature works by a few general principles. The task of the rest of Book 3 is to find those principles, above all sympathy, and the conventions that give rise to the artificial virtues. Book 3, Part 2, of Justice and Injustice. The second part of Book 3 develops Hume's most original contribution to moral and political philosophy, the theory that justice is an artificial virtue, a human invention that arises from our circumstances and necessities, rather than a natural instinct implanted in us. He begins from a principle about motives. When we praise an action, he says, we regard only the motive that produced it. The external performance has no merit of its own, but is esteemed only as the sign of some virtuous motive within. From this he draws a crucial rule against circularity. The first virtuous motive that gives an action its merit can never be simply the regard to the action's own virtue, for that would be to reason in a circle. An action must already be virtuous before we can have a regard to its virtue, so there must be some other, distinct motive that first makes it so. No action, in short, can be virtuous unless there is in human nature some motive to produce it apart from the sense of its morality. Hume then applies this test to justice, taking the plain case of repaying a loan. What natural motive, distinct from the mere sense of honesty, moves me to restore what I have borrowed? He canvasses the candidates and rejects each. It is not self-interest, for self-love, left to itself, is the very source of injustice and violence rather than its cure. It is not a regard to the public interest, for that is a motive too remote and too refined for ordinary people, and secret acts of justice which the public never knows of still bind us. It is not a love of mankind as such, for, he says bluntly, there is no such passion in human minds as the love of mankind merely as such. Our concern for others always works through some particular relation or through sympathy. And it is not private benevolence toward the person concerned, for he may be a stranger, or an enemy, or a worthless miser. Nothing natural remains. And so Hume concludes that our sense of justice is not derived from nature, but arises artificially, though inevitably, from education and human conventions. He is careful to add that calling justice artificial does not make it arbitrary, and that since the invention is obvious and absolutely necessary, the rules of justice may still fittingly be called laws of nature. How, then, does the convention arise? Hume paints the human condition as a peculiar and unfavorable combination of great needs with slender natural means to satisfy them. Only society remedies this. By joining our forces we become more powerful, by dividing our labors more skillful, and by mutual aid less exposed to accident. But two obstacles threaten society. The first is internal, not sheer selfishness, for Hume thinks the kind affections in most people outweigh the selfish, but the partiality of our generosity, which is confined to our friends and family, and so sets us at odds with others. The second is external, and lies in the nature of goods. Of the three sorts of goods we enjoy, the internal satisfaction of our minds, the external advantages of our bodies, and the possessions we have acquired, only the last are at once easily taken from us by others and capable of being transferred without loss, and there is never enough of them to satisfy everyone. It is this instability of possession, joined to their scarcity, that is the chief source of trouble, and the remedy comes not from nature but from artifice, from a convention to bestow stability on the possession of external goods. This convention, Hume stresses, is not a promise, for promises themselves presuppose conventions. It is only a general sense of common interest, which all the members of society express to one another, and which leads them to regulate their conduct accordingly. His illustration has become famous. Two men who pull the oars of a boat do it by an agreement or convention, though they have never exchanged any promise. The rule of justice arises gradually and gathers force by slow degrees, as we repeatedly feel the inconvenience of breaking it. And he compares it to the way languages arise gradually without any promise, and to the way gold and silver become the common measures of exchange. Only after this convention is in place do the ideas of justice and injustice, and along with them property, right, and obligation, come into being. Property, indeed, is nothing but those goods whose stable possession is established by the rules of society. The so-called state of nature, a war of all against all, he dismisses as a mere philosophical fiction that never could have existed, the mirror image of the poets, Golden Age, and he states his conclusion as a settled proposition. It is only from the selfishness and confined generosity of men, together with the scanty provision nature has made for their wants, that justice derives its origin. Increase men's benevolence far enough, or nature's bounty far enough, and justice would become useless. Where goods are unlimited, as with air and water, no rules of property apply. This explains what Hume calls the natural obligation to justice, which is interest. But there remains the moral question. Why do we feel that injustice is not merely disadvantageous, but wrong, even when it does not touch us? Here he turns to sympathy. When an act of injustice is committed far from us and against our own interest, it still displeases us, because we consider it as prejudicial to human society and injurious to those concerned in it, and we partake of their uneasiness by sympathy. So Hume states the two-tiered structure of the virtue with great precision. Self-interest is the original motive to the establishment of justice, but sympathy with the public interest is the source of the moral approbation that attends it. This natural progress, he adds, is helped along by the arts of politicians and by education, which reinforce our esteem for justice, though the politicians could never create the sentiment from nothing. Nature must furnish the materials. Hume observes a feature of justice that distinguishes it sharply from the natural virtues. A single act of justice, he says, is frequently contrary to the public interest, as when we restore a great fortune to a miser or a seditious bigot who will use it badly. It is only the whole scheme or system of justice, steadily maintained, that is indispensable to society. Justice, therefore, works like a convention in which every individual act is performed in the expectation that others will act likewise, even where that particular act does harm. He then explains the more particular rules by which property, once made stable, is actually assigned to persons, rules that must be general and inflexible rather than tailored to the merits of individuals. Present possession at the first founding of society, and thereafter occupation or first possession, long prescription, accession, and succession or inheritance. He treats the transfer of property by consent as a further law of nature that remedies the rigidity of mere stability, and he notes the curious human need for symbolic delivery, handing over the key of a granary to convey the corn, or a stone and earth to convey a manor, which he compares, with characteristic irony, to the ceremonies of religion. The obligation of promises receives the same treatment. A promise, Hume argues, would not even be intelligible before human conventions established it, and even if it were, it would carry no natural moral force. The act of the mind in promising cannot be a mere resolving or willing or desiring of the thing promised. It would have to be a willing of the obligation itself. But all morality depends on our sentiments, and we can no more change our sentiments by an act of will, he says, than we can change the motions of the heavens. So to will an obligation into being is absurd, and a promise, considered naturally, is something altogether unintelligible. Promises are therefore human inventions, founded on the interests of society. He gives another memorable illustration of the problem they solve. Your corn is ripe today, he imagines one neighbor saying to another. Mine will be ripe tomorrow. It is to the advantage of both of us that I should help you today, and you help me tomorrow. But I have no real kindness for you, and know you have as little for me, so I will not labor on your account, expecting no return, and you will treat me likewise, and the seasons change, and both of us lose our harvests for want of mutual confidence. The invention of promising, a certain form of words by which we bind ourselves under the penalty of never being trusted again, is what makes such cooperation possible. Interest, he says, is the first obligation to the performance of promises, and afterward a sentiment of morals concurs with the interest. Their artificiality is shown by the exceptions we recognize, that words spoken in jest do not bind, and that a promise extorted by force is void, flexibilities that fit the convenience of society rather than any eternal principle. From property and promises, Hume turns to the origin of government. If men see so clearly their interest in justice, why is there ever disorder? Because, he answers, men are governed by the imagination, and are drawn far more strongly to what is near than to what is remote. We prefer a trivial present advantage to a greater but distant good, and so we constantly violate our own known interest by preferring the contiguous. Since we cannot change this bias in human nature at large, we change our situation instead. We set up a few persons, the civil magistrates, kings and their ministers, whose immediate interest lies in the execution of justice, and who are made indifferent to most of the quarrels of society. Here, he says, is the origin of civil government and of allegiance. Government also serves to decide disputes impartially, and to make possible the vast cooperative works, the building of bridges, the raising of armies, the draining of meadows, that 1,000 persons could never agree upon among themselves, though two neighbors easily might. On the source of our allegiance, Hume again distinguishes interest from moral sentiment, and again attacks the theory that government rests on an original contract. He grants that government first arises alongside the obligation of promises, and often out of the quarrels not within a society, but between societies, so that, as he puts it, camps are the true mothers of cities, and the earliest governments tend to be monarchical. But he denies that allegiance continues to depend on any promise. Once established, obedience to government takes root of itself and acquires an original obligation, independent of all contracts, grounded in the separate interest we have in the order and protection that government provides. He appeals to the common sense of mankind, who feel that they are born to obey the government under which they live, not that they have consented to it. And he notes that people living under an absolute government who never consented to anything still feel bound. On the limits of obedience, Hume reaches a conclusion that later readers found strikingly liberal, but by his own route. Since interest is the ground of allegiance, when a magistrate's oppression grows so severe that his rule becomes intolerable, the cause of our obedience ceases, and so must the effect. We are then no longer bound to submit. Resistance to a violent tyranny, he says, is lawful without any crime or injustice, and the memory of those who resisted tyrants like Nero or Philip II enjoys the favor of every reader. In ordinary times, however, submission is the rule, and the choice of particular rulers is settled by general principles: long possession, present possession, conquest, succession, and positive law, rather than by anyone's private view of the public good. He extends the analysis to the laws of nations, the duties that bind states to one another, arguing that these rest on the same conventional foundation, but bind with less force, because the interest sustaining them, though real, is less urgent than the interest that sustains justice among individuals. And, in a final, more delicate discussion, he treats chastity and modesty as further artificial virtues, arising from the interest society has in the raising of children and the difficulty of establishing paternity, an interest that fixes upon women a special reputation and its attendant sentiments. Book 3, Part 3, of the Other Virtues and Vices. The third part of Book 3 completes the moral system by treating the natural virtues, those that depend on no human contrivance, and by drawing the whole account together. Hume returns to his foundational psychology. The chief spring of the human mind, he says, is pleasure or pain, and when these are removed, we are incapable of passion, action, or desire. Moral distinctions rest on peculiar pleasures and pains of this sort. His general definition of virtue is now stated plainly. Whatever mental quality in ourselves or others gives us a satisfaction upon survey or reflection is virtuous, and whatever gives uneasiness is vicious. Virtue is simply the power of producing love or pride. Vice, the power of producing hatred or humility. And since we judge only durable qualities of character, an action counts as virtuous or vicious only as the sign of some quality that lies behind it. The mechanism that explains the natural virtues is once again sympathy, which Hume now calls the chief source of moral distinctions. Human minds, he says, are like strings equally wound up, so that the motion of one communicates itself to the rest. We infer the feelings of others from their causes and effects, and sympathy converts the mere idea of their feeling into the feeling itself. This is why we approve of qualities useful to society, even when they do not touch our own interest. We enter, by sympathy, into the good of those who are affected. And it explains why beauty and moral worth are so alike, for in both a quality that is fitted to give pleasure to its possessor, or to others pleases the disinterested spectator too. Hume organizes the whole field of personal merit under 4 heads. Every quality of the mind, he says, is esteemed virtuous because it is agreeable or useful, either to the person himself or to others. These 4 sources, usefulness to others, usefulness to oneself, agreeableness to others, and agreeableness to oneself, exhaust the kinds of merit. Benevolence and justice are useful to others. Prudence, industry, and temperance are useful to their possessor. Wit and good manners are agreeable to others. Cheerfulness and a due self-esteem are agreeable to oneself. He answers 2 natural objections. The first is that our sympathy varies, being stronger for those near to us, yet we judge a virtuous man in China as favorably as one in our own country. Hume answers that we correct the unsteady reports of immediate sympathy by adopting some steady and general points of view, a common standard fixed for the sake of conversation and judgment, even though our passions do not always follow the correction our judgment makes. The second objection is that we esteem a virtuous character even when circumstances prevent it from doing any good. Virtue in rags, he says, is still virtue. He answers that a character fitted to benefit society pleases us through the imagination's easy passage, from the quality to its natural tendency, whether or not the tendency is realized, just as a well-designed house pleases even if no one lives in it. He then applies the four-source scheme to a range of qualities. A due degree of pride, well-founded and decently concealed, is a genuine merit, useful and agreeable to its possessor, and essential, he says, to the character of a man of honor, though good breeding requires that we veil it. Heroism and greatness of mind he analyzes as a steady and well-established self-esteem, dazzling to the spectator even when its social effects are destructive. Goodness and benevolence, the tender and social affections, are esteemed both for their usefulness and for their immediate agreeableness. The benevolent man's very weaknesses, an excess of grief or tenderness, appear amiable, while cruelty is the most detested of all vices. He offers a simple test of a perfect character. If there is no relation of life in which one could not wish to stand toward a particular person, then his character must so far be allowed to be perfect. He argues that the natural abilities of the mind, good sense, wit, memory, application, are as truly virtues as the more solemn moral qualities, since the distinction between them is merely verbal. They, too, win love and esteem, and the objection that they are involuntary fails, since many acknowledged virtues, like courage and magnanimity, are equally involuntary, and since merit does not in fact depend on free will at all. And he notes that the advantages of body and of fortune, health, beauty, and riches produce esteem by the same four principles, chiefly through our sympathy with the pleasure their possessor enjoys. In the conclusion of the whole book, Hume gathers his results. Sympathy, he repeats, is the chief source of our moral sentiments. It alone can account for the approbation we give to justice, allegiance, chastity, and good manners, and no objection can be raised against it, in one case, that will not extend to all. He observes with satisfaction that his system is self-supporting in a way that others are not. The sense of morals, reflecting on the very principles from which it arises, finds nothing there but what is laudable and good, so that morality approves of its own foundations. Though justice is an artificial virtue, he stresses once more, the sense of its morality is entirely natural, and its rules are as steadfast and immutable as anything founded on instinct, because they rest on the greatest and most universal of interests. He ends with an image for his whole enterprise. The philosopher who anatomizes human nature is like the anatomist rather than the painter. His dissections may be cold and unlovely in themselves, yet they are indispensable to the painter of the graces. An abstract speculation on the mind, however dry, is finally subservient to practical morality. A mind conscious of having failed in its part to mankind and society, he remarks, will never be able to bear its own survey. Appendix. To the completed treatise Hume added an appendix, notable above all for its honesty. Nothing, he says, would he more willingly lay hold of than an opportunity of confessing his errors, for a man who corrects his mistakes shows the justness of his understanding and the candor of his temper. He returns first to the nature of belief, restating and refining his earlier account. Belief, he argues, cannot consist in some new idea, such as an idea of existence, added to our conception of a thing, for we have no separate idea of existence to add, and if believing were merely a matter of joining an extra idea, it would be in a man's power to believe whatever he pleased, which it plainly is not. Belief, therefore, consists in a peculiar feeling or sentiment, one that does not depend on the will. The believed idea is conceived with more firmness, solidity, and steadiness, and strikes upon us with more force, approaching nearer to the liveliness of an impression. He confesses, in a candid note, that belief seems to him one of the greatest mysteries of philosophy, and that even when he thinks he understands the subject perfectly, he is at a loss for words to express his meaning. The difference between a fiction and a serious conviction lies not in the parts of the idea, but in the manner of conceiving it, a difference he can name only by such terms as force, vivacity, solidity, or firmness. But the heart of the appendix is Hume's remarkable retraction, or rather his confession of failure, concerning personal identity. He had hoped that his account of the mind would be free of the contradictions that plague our theories of the external world, but on a stricter review of the section on personal identity, he writes, he finds himself involved in such a labyrinth that he must confess he neither knows how to correct his former opinions, nor how to render them consistent. He is clear about what still seems to him well established. We have no impression, and therefore no idea, of a self that is simple and continued. When he turns his reflection upon himself, He can never perceive this self without some perception, and never perceives anything but the perceptions, so that it is the composition of these perceptions that forms the self. So far, he says, he is carried by sufficient evidence. The trouble comes when he tries to explain the principle that binds the successive perceptions together and makes us attribute to them a real simplicity and identity. Here his account, he admits, is very defective. Perceptions are distinct existences, and the mind never perceives any real connection among distinct existences. So when he asks what unites them, all his hopes vanish, and he can find no theory that satisfies him. He states the difficulty as a clash of two principles that he can neither reconcile nor give up, that all our distinct perceptions are distinct existences, and that the mind never perceives any real connection among distinct existences. Had our perceptions inhered in something simple, or had the mind perceived some real bond among them, there would be no difficulty, but neither is the case. He claims in the end only the privilege of a skeptic, confessing that the difficulty is too hard for his understanding, while declining to pronounce it absolutely insuperable, and leaving open that others, or he himself on further reflection, might one day discover the reconciling hypothesis. That confession is a fitting close to the treatise as a whole, for it embodies the temper Hume had recommended from the start, a philosophy built strictly on experience, following its arguments wherever they lead, honest about the skeptical crisis they produce, and content in the end to be corrected by nature, by common life, and by further inquiry. Across its 3 books, the work had traced the mind from its simplest materials to its highest achievements, from impressions and ideas to the analysis of causation and the problem of induction, from the skeptical dissolution of substance, the external world, and the self, to nature's quiet restoration of ordinary belief, from the anatomy of pride, love, and the will, to the claim that reason is the servant of the passions, and from the origin of the moral sentiments in feeling and sympathy, to the theory of justice, promises, and government as human convention. Hume's hope, modestly stated, was to bring the science of human nature a little more into fashion, and to show that a careful, experimental study of ourselves is the true foundation of every other science. The treatise remains one of the fullest attempts ever made to carry that program through, and its central doubts and discoveries have shaped philosophy ever since.